Thank you for joining us in what promises to be a cracker of a session. After all, we are discussing a topic that has seen much interested, much concerned, and much heated debate. And as researchers on the Anti-Corruption Evidence Program, we have frequently discussed the title of today's conversation, and that's what it's going to be. It's going to be a conversation. And thought it would be good to put together our thoughts, especially now that we have some solid research coming in. But first, a few lines on what the Anti-Corruption Program is, the Anti-Corruption Evidence Program. The Anti-Corruption Evidence Program, or ACE as we researchers like to call it because it has a nice ring to it, is a £15 million program funded by the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And it operates on one common principle, that top-down technical and enforcement approaches to anti-corruption haven't really worked. Also, it refreshingly moves away from the paradigm of anti-corruption research that rests on simply unearthing corruption in the hope that information would somehow make the problem disappear. And there are two halves of the ACE program. The first is Global Integrity, based in Washington, which is why the good morning. And the second is SOAS University of London, based in the UK, which is why the good afternoon. But I'm sure there are a lot of you across the world for whom it is quite a good evening. So Global Integrity and SOAS, instead of unearthing the corruption information, take the complexity of corruption as a starting point and then move deeper into evidence-based research on finding effective anti-corruption solutions. And the questions of what works and in what context are extremely key to the research that both of us are doing. And this actually becomes even more important when considering gender. So both halves of the program, and I'm part of that, I'm Pallavi Roy, and I am research director for the SOAS-ACE part of the program. Both halves of the program bring together a bunch of very committed and lively researchers from across developing countries in Europe, in the UK, and in US to provide some very relevant insights into what makes anti-corruption actually possible and operationalizable. But one of the issues that all of us have grappled with at some point during our research has been how to better incorporate questions of gender into anti-corruption research that goes much beyond just collecting disaggregated data. That's just the baseline now. But what more can we do? And we realized that some of our most heated conversations were actually around this. So we decided to open it up, bring in an audience like you and air our experiences on this in order for all of us to go back to our home offices and hopefully soon back to our fields with a richer understanding of how to bring about gendered analysis into anti-corruption research, which, as you will see when all of us talk about it, has its own specificities. And I know that we are pressed for time, so I'm not going to go into the details of what the Global Integrity part of ACE and the SOAS part of ACE talk about. But both programs have a very, very well managed and very websites. We work across a whole host of sectors and issues. They could be largely involving financial flows, or it could be on specific sectors like electricity or skills training. But if you're interested, do take a look at our website. Today, we are talking about how we've dealt with the question of gender mainstreaming within anti-corruption research. And to really talk about what the details of those heated conversations were, I'm now going to pass on the screen to my colleague from Global Integrity, Johannes. Johannes, over to you. Take us through.
Great. Well, thank you, Pallavi, and good morning, everyone. Welcome. Very pleased to see so many of you. I am Johannes Tonn. I lead Global Integrity's anti-corruption work, and as part of that, one of my roles is to co-lead jointly with Paul Haywood the Global Integrity Anti-Corruption Evidence Program. I want to take just a few minutes to frame the rationale and the starting point for this conversation today. At its core, inquiries into corruption are really inquiries into power inequities. If our goal as researchers and or as practitioners oftentimes, if our goal is to understand the logic, the scale, and the impact of these power inequities, how they affect the world, and what we can do to counter them, we must explore the reasons for why they exist, how they play out, and how they perpetuate over time. An important subset of these power inequities and the resulting injustices is really found in gender inequality. Women disproportionately are affected by corruption, and that prevents societal progress from happening on at least, I would say, three dimensions. One is normative, it prevents the realization of universal human dignity, But then we get to instrumental grounds, which is that women are prevented from realizing their potential to contribute in various ways and to reap the rightful benefits. And then the third, and that's sort of like at the collective level, the third dimension is that it prevents the realization of development outcomes more broadly. In turn, then, that means that anti-corruption research should be cognizant of and actively exploring what the impacts of gender inequities are, how they can be tackled, and what the results might be if we do a better job at understanding and tackling them. So here then we arrive at some of those questions that we should ask ourselves. What are the implications for research if we start our inquiries with an understanding that it is really power inequities that shape the world? What impacts specifically should we focus on? What mechanisms and what methods? To what extent should gender feature as either a dependent variable or as an independent variable or a combination of both? And overarchingly, and that is, I think, what organizations have done over the past decade or 15 years, how might we go about authentically and meaningfully mainstreaming gender in anti-corruption research? Those, I think, are the questions at the core of today's discussion, and they reflect a realization by both of our programs that on the one hand, we have a shared understanding about the importance of gender. On the other hand, in practice, our framing of the projects, the framing of the programs, and within the program, the projects have not quite lived up to taking action that mirrors that understanding fully. So our programs do take account of gender, but not as much as they could. Let me just try to minimize my screen here. Great. So there are two key insights that I want to share based on a survey that we recently completed over the last week within the GIACE program. And I should say thank you to all the researchers, to all the projects that have at short notice filled in this survey and have taken the time to really provide some good answers. The first one you can see on this slide. There is on the left-hand side, you can see our question as to whether research projects think it is important to be gender aware in anti-corruption research. And you can see that, you know, a vast majority of projects says that is important to do. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see their perception, their experience or their opinion about how well their own projects take account of gender in their projects. And you can see that there's a differential between the left-hand side thinking it is important and then the realization that in the actual projects, there is less of a gender lens. The second insight, and I don't want to read this out aloud, is to just again thank our researchers for putting in some thinking and some comments and some reflections and some questions on how they have thought about gender and what that means in their projects. And maybe I can just leave this on screen for a minute and have you skim through this. But I think it does represent a great variety of questions and thoughts that occur throughout the projects and point us to a number of open questions that are worthwhile discussing further. So I'll just leave this on for a minute and then I'll move on. Great, and with that, I think I can move into the next phase of this discussion, which is to introduce our panel. Thank you so much to Claudia Baez Camargo from the Basel Institute on Governance, who leads 2 GIACE projects, and to Jacqueline Klopp from the Columbia Earth Institute at Columbia University, who leads another GIACE project. Thank you so much for taking the time to prepare for this event, to think through it, and to join us on the panel. And also, and that is somebody who I'm very pleased to introduce, welcome and thank you so much, Sohela Nazneen, for joining us and helping us in framing this event and thinking it through. Sohela is a feminist political economist at the Institute of Development Studies. And she has done a tremendous amount of work on gender questions and how gender plays out in various aspects of development and governance. And she has agreed to generously share today's session and moderate the session. With that, I think I'm gonna hand it over to you, Sohela. Thank you.
Thank you, Johannes, and thank you to Johannes and Pallavi for framing the event, and also thank you to GIS for inviting me to moderate the event. I'm just going to run through the quick rules in terms of how the session is going to run, and a lot of you are familiar with it because you participate regularly in this kind of discussion. So we will have two quick fire rounds. So I will invite each of the panelists in the first round to speak for 7 minutes. And then we will have pause for a bit to see if there are any questions that require clarification, any issue, only clarification, not you have to hold your fire. So we will move on to the second round, which is for 3 or 4 minutes. Each panelist will respond to a specific question I pose to them. And after that, it will be open for plenary and debate. You can either unmute yourself and ask the question live, or if you want to put your question in the side panel in the chat box, that's fine, and we'll collate those. So that's basically the ground rules. So let's move on to the exciting discussion that we have planned. And I know all the panelists have very insightful, but also provoking things to say. So we'll start with you, Pallavi. So Pallavi, you work on the supply side, right? And looking at gender is a challenge when you work on supply side. So how has gender come up in the work that you do and on anti-corruption, but also what are the key challenges here in terms of if you want to take a gender lens?
Thank you, Sohela. No, you've got that absolutely right. I do want to begin with some of the specificities of how we frame anti-corruption in SOAS-ACE. But before that, let's just take a step back and understand what corruption is. And it's universally accepted that corruption is an abuse of power, where power is used to violate rules. And therefore, the people involved in corruption are usually more powerful than on average. And this implies a sense of hierarchy. And we take our work from here. When we say supply side, what do we actually mean? That we are looking for solutions on the side of delivery, on the people who are actually providing the services, whether it's providing electricity at the fair cost, whether it's providing fertilizers without capturing subsidies, whether it's providing skills training without any kind of capture with the firm you are joining up to train with. So that's what we mean by supply side solution, as opposed to the demand side solution, which, as we know, is about mobilizing networks, organizing vulnerable networks, whether they be of poorer sections of society, whether they be of women. We are looking firmly at the supply side. And here I will ask you to bear with me, because I am hugely simplifying 4 years of research and umpteen working papers worth of work into 7 minutes. I know brevity is the name of the game, so it might sound like I'm condensing a lot, but I'm going to give this a try. So our research, keeping the hierarchy that I just discussed, our research actually looks at who is violating the rules on that supply side and for what reasons. And we make a very critical distinction between the kinds of reasons for which rules are actually being violated. And I'll come to why that's very important. That's played a very important part in us framing our solutions. Once we've done that mapping, we then locate the potentially productive players within that mapping that we've done, who will then enforce rules in their own interest, because that's one way of making sure that rules are enforced. I am breaking rules because it's not in my interest, sorry, or I'm keeping to rules and obviously by definition reducing corruption and improving a certain outcome, because it's in my interest to keep to those rules and to enforce those rules. But given the hierarchy that we've just talked about in doing corruption research, and given that there is a structure of patriarchy, given that hierarchy, how power, how production, and how indeed delivery are structured usually means the interests and incentives of women in particular sectors that we are looking at are not often reflected. What does that mean for mainstreaming gender? It means that organically, this does not lead us to having a gender-based solution for every sector. And that actually chimes with some of what you read from the survey that has been done across for our GIS colleagues. But women are often involved in the organization of corruption when they're in relatively powerful position. That's also something that our research has found out. So depending on the structure of power, we need to find a solution that can feasibly improve outcomes, because first, we are an anti-corruption research program. So then our solution will be based on that studying of hierarchies, the interests and incentives, behaviors that we think can be changed in that group's self-interest, and that can involve women sometimes, sometimes not. And that in itself, I'm not sure whether, Sohela, that we can call that a challenge, but it is certainly an implication that we have to think through. And this is a good time to have that conversation, because as I mentioned in the beginning, we've, most of us have gone on to do about 3 or 4 years of work on anti-corruption, thanks to ACE. And this is something that we are now beginning to make sense of, as to what really is the implication of doing research of this kind and adding the sort of requirement of gender mainstreaming to it. So what has to be understood about the SOAS-ACE approach is that we look at feasible solutions on the supply side that improve outcomes. We look at how to improve delivery or productivity with a new set of rules, which is very different from, the sort of blueprint, more easily templatable anti-corruption solution of the demand side. The supply side is extremely complex. And extremely context-specific sectors, differ from one country to another. The fertilizer sector in Nigeria is vastly different from what we found in the fertilizer sector in the electricity sector in Nigeria. The same would work, let's say, in Bangladesh on the garment sector and the electricity sector. And therefore, the kind of solutions we are talking about and the communities of incentives and interests that we are talking about will also be very, very different. Conventional anti-corruption often assumes that supply-side solutions are very simple, that there are actually just a few bad eggs on that side, and all we need to do is to mobilize, is to organize, and to throw out those bad eggs, and then somehow the problem on the supply side will disappear. But as our research, and indeed other research has shown, that's absolutely not the case. Corruption on the supply side is extremely complex. It's not just about a little bit of greed and a little bit of discretion. You weed that out through pressure, and then everything will go back to being the same. That's absolutely not the case. Rules are being violated very often by everybody, but for very, very different reasons. So, which is why we're working in a field of immense frustration. We've had a lot of very, very high-powered anti-corruption movements, demands for unseating of powerful people. They've run a certain course, and then they run their ground. And why is that? Because we don't look at the other side of the delivery of a particular service. That's the supply side, again, that I keep talking about. So most of us know who's breaking the rules. We have full transparency, but we can't bring them to accountability. And one of the reasons is that we need to know why rules are being broken. I'm going to bring up a small example from our health sector research in Bangladesh. And we know that absenteeism is actually a form of corruption, because this is a huge constraint in terms of achieving universal health coverage. But absenteeism is almost endemic in Bangladesh and Nigeria. But is everybody absent on the job because they have very powerful political patrons? That's not the case. You will always have a small universe of doctors who have powerful political patrons, but some women and male doctors are absent because of very problematic structural reasons, which aren't linked to political power, which are linked to maybe other kinds of social constraints. For instance, a lot of women don't want to be posted in rural areas because of security reasons. A lot of male doctors don't want to be posted in rural areas because their families don't want to travel with them, and they obviously don't want to live alone. Now, these kinds of violations, the power political connection-based violations, and these violations are very different. And we can't absolutely use one hammer to strike all of them. So we make that difference. So is there something that we can do to solve the problem of security, to solve the problem of location for the doctors who actually don't want to be absent? That small core of people who have powerful political patrons, we probably won't be able to do much about. So in this case, women become part of the solution on that side. But we therefore need to ask of ourselves in such situations that, of the demands that we are making, can they actually be met? If we punish everybody together with the same kind of punishment, within 6 months, people are going to go back to breaking the rules because the ultimate systemic issue hasn't been solved. And that is why we think it is difficult for us to add in the sort of organizational gendered elements into our anti-corruption research. Where possible, we've done it in the health sector in Bangladesh, in the Niger Delta in Nigeria, and I'm happy to talk about that, where women are a very strong constituency, and as boundary partners, they're both impacted by corruption, but can also have an effect on how policy works. So it's not about a challenge. I think it's much more about an opportunity and understanding the implications, because while we are not saying that we are working with women on every project or using the gendered angle on every project as a solution, I think our understanding also is that the impact of our supply side solution will have a very strong impact on women, because corruption in providing delivery has a very high damaging impact on women all around. So there is certainly the impact side of it, but on the solution side of it, it's not something that we can see for ourselves at every project that we are doing, simply because of the framework we're based on. I'm hoping, Sohela, that answers some of the questions that you asked, and I'll be waiting to see what the others have to say.
Sure, I'm sure your fellow panelists will be reacting to what you're saying. So in terms of the sectoral variation and impact of corruption, yes, there are gender-based differentials in terms of the impact, but also then how do you get people involved, and whether women would be involved in every single case, that varies across contexts. But then that brings us to other types of queries and questions. So Claudia, I'm going to move on to you. You had said that we shouldn't assume, and it came up also in sort of the survey results that we looked at, that we shouldn't always think how you bring in gender requires careful consideration and in terms of design, but then you can't always think about gender as a priori aspect. And you have interesting experience around that in terms of looking at 2 projects. So do you want to talk a little bit about that, Claudia, and your views on what are the challenges?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Sohela, and thanks everybody for this opportunity. So I would like to touch on 2 broad issues in this first intervention. So first one, I think that a key question is how to approach gender as a research topic. So is it meaningful to do it in a top-down way? So mainstreaming and assuming that there has to be a gender angle in every research project? Or do we do it bottom up, rather inductively, letting the issues that have to do with gender emerge out of the evidence? So as you already hinted, I'm on the second camp, and that's because in my experience, I have found that it's really difficult to anticipate a priori where and how the relevant insights will be found. So to give you an example, in one of our GIACE projects where we're looking at bribery in the Tanzanian health sector, we did try to integrate a gender element from the beginning. For example, by asking research respondents how gender matters for bribery, frequency of being asked for a bribe in public hospitals. And this turned out to be completely not a useful question. It doesn't seem to be a gendered issue. On the other hand, other projects that we've had in our past or other non-GIACE projects, for example, one in Malawi where we were looking at corruption in the private sector, talking to businesswomen, it became very quickly evident that in Malawi, women entrepreneurs face the double burden of not just being asked for a bribe, but also often being asked for sexual favors in order to get their goods cleared at the border or getting their business permits. So this is the so-called double bribe. In another example, in our previous research on social norms and petty corruption in East Africa, one topic that came out very loudly and very, without even having to nudge for it was again, the issue of sexual favors being exchanged for access to public services, for getting the child enrolled in school, and also women using sex instrumentally to solve problems. So I think that in my experience, these topics arise, it becomes obvious that they are important. And then as a next step, we can, for example, conduct more research to really fully understand what are the situations and the drivers around the problems that we have identified, and try to support interventions to address the issues. My second theme is that I think that research is really very important to help us ascertain what works and what doesn't work in terms of measures to improve gender inequality. So for instance, the idea of mainstreaming, one-size-fits-all solutions like imposing quotas, for example, in political office. Last week, this is not my personal experience, but last week I was in another panel where a group of researchers were sharing their findings. And the two projects were looking at these quota systems. And there was one that looked at the case of Somalia. And one of the conclusions was that increased number of women in power does not translate into necessarily more influence for women. Women were viewed as not being trustworthy. And what lies underneath this issue is the strong tribalism that prevails in Somalia and the fact that women are seen as, suspect because they have this dual association with the husband and the father's tribe. So that gives them a kind of, not very trustworthy stance. The other research project was looking in Kenya at the increase of the number of women in positions of powers. And ironically, they found that this actually resulted in decreased influence because women were given positions without power. So just nominal positions to tick the box, to fill the quotas, but without really giving women power. And I think that this is a research that is really very important because we have to also be aware of unintended consequences of, well-intentioned measures to empower women, but which might backfire. Like in these cases, we're having more women in positions, formal positions of power is actually not translating into more empowerment, but can convey a false illusion that equality or more equality has been achieved. So I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. And that's before time. So that's fantastic. So I hear what you're raising in terms of challenges of mainstreaming. And of course, you cannot have a blanket solution, right? It's not one size fits all in terms of whether that is integrating a gender lens in research or whether that is about the solution in terms of how you address anti-corruption efforts. And it's not necessarily getting more women into power and that would reduce corrupt tendencies. And it's certainly not, you also need to look at the different aspects of corruption itself. So you're talking about sextortion and sexual currency as we talk about. So those are all very interesting and food for thought in terms of thinking about how do we think about corruption, but also like in terms of bringing a gender lens, how do we go about it? So I will now move on to Jackie, who I know gender came in quite big in her research in the area that she looks at, particularly informal cross-border trade. So Jackie, would you like to tell us about how gender has come up in your research and what are your views in terms of integrating a gender lens?
Yeah, thank you, Sohela, and to the other speakers. So I think one really big question is around this, we know that corruption is linked heavily to power and power dynamics, as Pallavi was saying. And corruption often tends to harm the most vulnerable. And poor women are among that category of the most vulnerable. So in my mind, corruption and questions of gender are intimately connected. And one big question is, at the very beginning, are we really creating enough anti-corruption projects that focus on gender to begin with? And that's really about problem definition at the very beginning. What do we look at and why? Which is not to say all these other projects aren't, that may not have this initial, gender focus aren't important. But are we doing enough of these kinds of projects, I think is one question we need to ask. In my Global Integrity ACE project, I'm looking at ethical border trading in East Africa, and particularly at small scale cross-border traders. And these are primarily women. Across Africa, large portions of the percentages of these small scale traders are women. And the reason they're women is often, that they're on the small scale trade, it is, that there's an enormous amount of discrimination in terms of access to land and capital and, education and the economy. And so these women have carved out a niche to help their families and their communities. And so at the very beginning, by focusing on them, we care about this gender inequality and how in the process of them doing their trade and trying to support their families, they're encountering what Claudia mentioned, corruption in the form of bribes, and also sexual harassment. The sextortion that Claudia mentioned is very serious. So we put together a project that in some ways is unique because we started off with a women-run social enterprise called SOAS-ACE Africa, which really is already focused on these primarily small-scale cross-border traders who are primarily women. So they already have a gender angle and focus. And because of the spread of cell phones, this social enterprise had come up with the idea of actually helping women get more information about their trade by cell phone. So it's a platform on the cell phone. And we were wondering if we could use that as a tool to study how we might do community monitoring, get more information, start creating more of a culture of better service across the borders, and actually do research. So it was really a project that was already just at the beginning, a network of women scholars and, gender angled approach to a problem. And then in terms of our analysis, I think it was, we really felt it was important, and this comes up with gender mainstreaming, that we disaggregate information that we're getting. So we were doing surveys. With COVID, we kind of focused on phone surveys, to know, like, are there differences between men and women in terms of their experiences of harassment and bribery? And then because we also cared about this question of voice, like, we're not just going to ask them questions about their individual interactions, but we wanted to know, like, are they involved in associations? What do they think about where their money goes when they give these bribes and what their options are? So we were asking much broader questions, trying to understand how they organize and if there are ways to support them better at that collective action level. And then we also were thinking, well, what are the existing anti-corruption efforts to help these women? And do they have an appropriate gender angle? And one thing we saw was that there was a very large focus on a lot of the anti-corruption efforts at the level of large-scale trade, the more economically powerful and male-dominated sector. And so also just really a focus on getting that trade across faster, more efficiently. So there were these things called one-stop border posts to make these transactions more streamlined. But these reforms did not take into account these small scale, primarily women traders. And so there was some work after the fact to try to make them more friendly, but they are failing. So the majority of women are still often going through these informal routes, which are far more precarious. And they have developed with police and the security people a kind of system of norms of giving them bribes to enable them to do their trade. And within these interactions, there's a lot of fear and a lot of potential sexual harassment and actual harassment that happens. And so because of this gender bias in the very structure of, the way the trade is done, and also even the anti-corruption efforts are not addressing their needs, we're seeing these traders still highly vulnerable. And so my point is that you know, maybe we also have to ask questions of whether we're doing enough of these more, you know, these anti-corruption efforts through a gender angle. And are we really creating a, you know, research agenda that addresses some of the most vulnerable to corruption, which are often poor women in many countries. So I'm going to stop there. But I really want to, you know, step back and talk about that agenda setting aspect as well around anti-corruption efforts. So thank you.
Thank you, Jackie. That is going to move us very nicely into the second round, because you're talking about agenda setting, but you're also talking about the structural space that we operate in terms of when you ask the question, why don't we have more projects that takes an active gender lens? I mean, of course, there are challenges that Claudia and both Pallavi illuminated, but then why doesn't it happen more? So before we move on to the second round, just a very quick thing for the audience. This is being recorded, as you all know, so it's not Chatham House rules. So if you want to ask questions, feel free to ask whatever you want. You do have freedom of speech, but remember that that will be publicly broadcasted. So keep that in mind. The other thing is feel free to keep the questions coming in the chat box, but if you have any questions that you want clarification on from the speakers, speak now or forever hold your peace till the second round happens. So any clarificatory question, not questions on how did you solve it or what did you do, because that's the second round. Okay, I will take it as I'm looking at the participant list and Ambika is keeping an eye. So if there are no queries or clarifications needed, then panelists, you can breathe the sigh of relief. You guys have been crystal clear in terms of discussing your cases. So let's move on to the second round. So let's start with you, Pallavi, again. So you talked about the challenges of working on the supply side, and you talked about how gender comes in terms of looking at the impact, but then how do you integrate gender, because then sectors vary and there are other kinds of variations, right? So basically two things. One is, of course, how did you resolve the dilemma? You talked a little bit about it already in terms of how gender popped up in certain research and how did you go forward investigating it. So in terms of talking about how did you resolve the dilemma, can you tell us in terms of what kind of methods or what kind of angle or what steps did you take once you realized that gender was quite important? And use a specific example. So that's part one of the question. Part two is, if you could have anything, what would be the top two things that you would recommend to integrate gender lens into the research or to change the landscape or agenda setting? So two things, very easy. You have 4 minutes. You're muted, Pallavi.
Sorry, everyone. That is the line of the century, of course. But it's good to know that one is under a time scanner. To address question one, Sohela, you know, I referred to the work that we are doing in the Niger Delta, and I have to say that the Niger Delta work is essentially looking at artisanal oil refining. Artisanal sounds like a very nice name, a nice, compact, sweet name for really big ticket corruption that happens, and that dovetails very well with our analysis of who's breaking the law and for what reason. And this wasn't even a project that we were going to do. We were really going to look at the big ticket leakages in the Nigerian oil sector. And then we looked down and we said, well, here's something really interesting happening at the community level, which goes against the entire grain of what we've been taught, that you mobilize the community against criminal activities, an activity that's horribly polluting the environment, and you should be getting a positive outcome. And we saw, well, that was actually just the opposite. The community was part of, highly polluting these artisanal refining activities, which essentially means crude is stolen and then it's cooked in a very low-tech way, and the local community then is able to buy petroleum products at reduced prices. And then you realize the incentive is such that why would they not support something that was corrupt and was polluting their environment when they were getting something, the payoff was actually so much higher than complying with the law. And women were a huge part of this, because women were not, while they were not directly involved in the manufacturing of the products, they were very closely indirectly involved with providing hospitality services, catering services, informal surveillance activities. And the only reason they were involved is they were getting a primary source of livelihood, which was just not available to them in the formal economy. The men might have found alternative formal jobs, alternative jobs in the formal economy, the women just wouldn't. And that's when you work with the women, with local NGOs and community organizations, to then devise a program. And a lot of good work has already been done by our partner SDN there in terms of creating alternative livelihoods for women there. And that's where we could actually bring these two parts of the research together, already work in a solution. But it's not something that we found, let's say, in the Nigerian electricity sector, which was on SMEs. And you could say, well, SMEs is an area where you could actually bring in a gender element. But the level of corruption and the sort of incentive structure that we were talking about did not allow us to directly add on a gender element. But of course, if we improve power for SMEs, in general, any woman-owned SME also benefits, by association. So that was one. The Niger Delta example, I think, was very interesting learning for us. On your point, very quickly about what two things I would do very differently, I think it's that conversation on activists who work on the demand side. I think that's becoming increasingly important, and that's an implication, and I take that as an opportunity. I think both our entire team at SOAS-ACE, we take that as an opportunity as to how do we then make our work complementary. We work on the supply side, bring in gender political economists, gender activists from the demand side so that we can actually sit together and work. But this needs us to backtrack 2 steps. It's how research is designed, so how we design research as anti-corruption researchers and practitioners, and how funders fund. Because right now there really is no sort of funding design. Forget the research design, even funding design that makes it a 2-step approach. And I think this is a kind of 3-way conversation across all sides in how to fund and how to redesign gender on anti-corruption. I think that's where I'll leave it at. So I'd be very interested to hear what Claudia and Jackie have to say on this. Thanks, Sohela.
Thank you, Pallavi. So 2 key points I'm hearing from you in terms of how research is funded, that affects the design, and also in terms of talking to other stakeholders, both community of scholars, but also people who are on the ground. So let's move on to Claudia. Same question for you. I mean, you gave us quite a few examples in how gender popped up in your research, and you have a very strong position on mainstreaming, but you face different challenges in the different projects. So how did you resolve that in terms of integrating a better gender lens? And also, what would be the top 2 things on your wish list to change the agenda or better research with a gender angle on anti-corruption?
Thank you, Sohela. Yeah, so maybe to answer the first question, let me go back to, as you have rightly well identified, my position is to that mainstreaming, as an a priori approach, I don't think is the best way to go, but that we should rather be targeting gender where it really matters. I really do believe, and I'm happy to be convinced by colleagues, this is my personal opinion. I don't think that all corruption problems have a gender angle, just as not all gender problems have a corruption issue underlying them. So I think that in the bigger, we have to look at the bigger picture, and we have to be very, clear and strategic about what exactly are the problems that we're trying to solve. So rather than going from some undefined standard of justice that somehow we have to, fight for women's rights and equality in an abstract way, I think that we need to have clear objectives. And this is a topic that I also bring up, in my anti-corruption work, which is that we don't do anti-corruption work for the sake of it, fighting corruption just for the sake of it, but rather because corruption has clear costs, has clear, damages, and it's really hindering us from achieving key social justice and development outcomes. And I think the same thing should be for gender. And it seems to me that in this bigger picture, gender issues are often compounded by poverty and other factors of vulnerability, like Jackie said. So therefore, I think that we should be able to articulate very clearly against which criteria we are prioritizing gender in our anti-corruption research. For example, and this is where I bring my experience, I think we should be looking, for example, at the types of corruption that are most preventing women from prospering, from getting ahead. So again, 2 examples from my research, and in the Tanzanian health sector again, there is a huge issue with teenage pregnancy. So in Tanzania, teenage girls who become pregnant automatically are forbidden from going back to school. So it's like a double punishment. And of course, this throws girls in such a situation, into such a, state of despair, and that and of course, abortion is illegal, right? So they become, I don't know, doubly, triply, I don't know how many fold times vulnerable and prey to corrupt health providers when they come looking for help. So I think this is for one example of one area that I found that I think really needs to be paid attention, because it's really preventing teenage girls from, even having the opportunity of making a life for themselves. And the other example, again, is going back to the Malawi businesswomen who are faced with this double bribery, and they are, of course, this affects their ability to become successful in their businesses. And there, what we've learned a couple of things. So for example, it's been very interesting to see how just out of these shared sets of challenges, there's already a network of Malawian businesswomen. It's kind of like a mutual help network that is really providing support and help for women who are faced with these kind of challenges. I still think that more needs to be done, for example, in terms of developing, testing and piloting gender-sensitive hotlines, because the stigma associated with this kind of problems and sometimes also the attitudes of male law enforcement, people who might be at the other end of the complaints line, really prevent women from coming out and denouncing sexual abuses more openly. So again, my point is we need to be narrow, we need to be precise, we need to make better use of our resources and efforts, and also, to be very clear that we are putting our efforts where the most gains are to be made, and to avoid unintended consequences. For example, given by just including a gender element or a gender quota or a gender solution for everything. I think this can give an appearance that something is being done without much impact. So that's the risk that I see. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Claudia. So you're basically saying, how do you make the gender agenda concrete? So in terms of what you're looking at, then having a precise focus, but also thinking about the traction in terms of what Johannes was saying. Where's the most impact? What's the problem you're trying to solve? And if it is about prosperity, well-being, etc. of women, then obviously you need to think about integrating a gender lens and working it through for having that context specificity. Jackie, last but not the least, what are your thoughts in terms of how do you resolve the challenges that you faced in terms of bringing in a gender lens, but also what are your top 2 wishes?
Yeah, it's great discussion. Well, I think we can't lose sight of the importance of gender mainstreaming. I do think that many of the frameworks are absolutely critical for us to use at the beginning of our projects. What I've found from studying the cross-border trade is that it is very possible for people to look at cross-border trade and not see a very overt dynamic, which is that the majority of the customs and the police are men, and the vast majority of small scale traders are women. And that, you know, already is just a reflection of deep-rooted gender inequality, and it sets up a situation where we see some of the, you know, extraction and the sexual harassment, gender-based violence. So, but it is possible, from what I've seen, to completely build a one-stop border post and think about the trucks going through and not having a gender lens, and then misdesigning and making women more vulnerable. So I think my first plea would be, let's not throw out the gender mainstreaming frameworks. Let's try to more systematically think about them at the beginning of our projects and have dialogues about them, because there could be hidden gender dynamics that actually will have an impact. And maybe we're not even seeing where some of our struggles for gender equality, for example, even, you know, having adequate number of equal number of female police officers and customs officers in a place where a large number of the traders are women, could reduce sexual harassment. But that's not really necessarily a mainstream discussion. So we might be missing out anti-corruption opportunities and anti-harassment opportunities by using the gender lens. And secondly, I agree with some of my colleagues about sort of this. Well, I feel like one of the things that we could do more is have more structured dialogue between the you know, those fighting heavily for gender equality, which is so fundamentally critical and doesn't always overlap completely with, you know, which is a struggle of its own, like Claudia was saying, just as sometimes, you know, certain corruption phenomena may not be so gendered and is a struggle on its own. But I think we need to bring these different communities together in more dialogue and perhaps new projects, because there are these elements where there's very important overlap on really, really big issues. So Pallavi talked about our environmental struggles, right? Or the environmental struggles, let's say in the Delta, which are our environmental struggles, because it's about oil and environmental damage, and including climate change, right? And one of the things we see is some of the movements around climate change and environmental justice, which also includes justice for women. You know, those are led primarily by women. You know, and there is this potential, because corruption is such a big part of not addressing issues like climate change, to find intersectional points for struggle. And I think we need to do that more and get out of our smaller, more kind of niche anti-corruption studies and see where we have these broader alliances. So I would, as something I would like to see happen, is more structured dialogue and maybe mobilizing or organizing along those lines. So I'll stop there.
Great, Jackie. I mean, intersectional alliances, that's like music to my ears in terms of who works on the movement side. But it's also sort of, I'm finding the whole dialogue very interesting, particularly the tension between, do we mainstream gender or not? Because partly if you have gender neutral frameworks, you will get gender neutral results. So that's part of the issue. But then also the struggle is with then how do you go look for the hidden impact? Do you look at women as actors, or do you look at gender specific impact of what is happening in that sector? Like what works for which type of research, right? So to the audience, obviously we have reached the end of the 2 quickfire rounds. You can put the questions in the chat box and specify which speaker you want it addressed, or you can do it live on mic if you want to, and you sort of indicate that. So I believe we have a question that was posted way earlier, and this is for Claudia. So I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. Yukai, do you want to come live on mic and ask Claudia your question?
Yeah, thank you. I suppose it's not necessarily something Claudia has to answer directly. I think, yeah, this is just open conversation. But I think, yeah, the issue of how do we approach the issue of gender, and try to understand how gender fits into a particular issue. I think one argument is to assume, or not assume that not every issue has a gender element, but then that goes on to a difficult territory, in the sense that corruption itself is a complex issue. Then you add the element of sector and context, and then the concept of gender itself, how people define and understand gender, given that it is not just a binary man or woman issue, and that how people socially construct gender. So if we are to try to look for a gender lens, that is a complex issue that will not obviously appear to be, oh, this is a definite man or female issue. So as you rightly point out, there are certain approaches to which you address complex issues surrounding gender. And given that, a gender lens and gender dimension spectrum is bigger than just the binary man or woman. So it's actually interesting to know the extent to which transgender issues and how people identify themselves, and how that also intersects with corruption, and how we understand gender affects the research and affects our approach to understanding and tackling issues of gender. So so I just have an issue with just thinking that it will be very obvious to us to say, oh, this is a gender issue, men or women, it will be very clear. I think perhaps I'm just interested to know if there are certain ways in which we can go deeper and address complexity and do complex way research into trying to understand the very complex nature of gender itself as a concept. So I'm not sure where the question lies in there, but yeah, I just wanted to just get people's sense of their understanding in terms of gender, and how, they factor in the different types of research approaches that take into account complexity and the complex nature of gender itself.
So which one of the panelists wants to take this on, complexity, and how do you take that into account?
I'm happy to jump in. I think those were superb questions and comments. I think one way we deal with complexity is to have broader collaborations with people who are looking at maybe one element and all its nuance, and then bring people together. So I think one way to do it is to have collaborations where you are working with people who are working on feminist movements, gender, LGBTQ rights, and the corruption and governance, sort of looking at these things together. And they absolutely have complex connections. I mean, we see sometimes in our politics, when people want to, in power, want to avoid certain questions of accountability, they often target vulnerable groups. Whether that's women, as we see in Myanmar, the sort of patriarchal ideas of the military regime, or we've seen also, horrible, attacks on LGBTQ people in Africa and elsewhere, and so I think, I think we do need to see these complex connections, and one of the really good ways to do this is to have more collaborative projects where people come from the outside and sort of destabilize what's a more, narrow view. So thank you very much for that comment and that question.
Claudia? Claudia, do you have?
Yes, no, excellent question. Thank you so much. This is such an exciting discussion. So I want, maybe to reflect on the question, I would go back to something that Johannes said at the beginning, and he asked whether gender should be the dependent or the independent variable. And I think that really makes a difference. What kind of questions are we asking? So I think that there are very important topics for which, you know, we have other dependent variables. So like I was saying, this could be, you know, poverty, tackling extreme poverty. It can be under 5 mortality. It can be this kind of very key development goals that we want to improve on, for which there might be an independent gender variable that is really, you know, obstaculizing and you know, problematizing whether we achieve our goals or not. However, there's also, of course, a case to be made to have gender as the dependent variable. And I think what was raised in the question about, you know, using gender as going beyond the simple male-female dichotomy. We know it's a much more complicated landscape that we're dealing with, and it involves all sorts of discriminatory practices, inequality, and there is, I think, absolutely a case to be made for having gender as a dependent variable, where we explicitly research and look for the ways to improve on the tackle the discrimination and improve on advancing gender equality. So I think we just need to be very clear on what it is that we're trying to, you know, to focus on, and then, you know, I think the answer will come out more or less more clearly. Yeah.
Okay, Pallavi, do you want to quickly react to the comment made, and then we'll move on to the other questions that are in the chat box?
Yeah, very quickly. I first wanted to thank you for bringing up this very, very important point. And I will be very honest, you know, on the SOAS-ACE program, Mushtaq Khan, who heads it, and myself and other colleagues have really grappled with this question of, as you very correctly said, gender is not a binary. You know, there's a spectrum here that we are talking about. And if we are actually going to be true to gender mainstreaming, how is it that we even start defining it? And I think this is, I do think that this is a problem that, or a sort of problem solving attempt that is in its very early stages. I don't think we have effectively got our heads around how to do it. I completely agree with what Jackie said about more dialogue needed at the beginning, you know, where Claudia says about identifying in the beginning. So it could well be that a certain sector that we've picked, you know, does not sort of lend itself to that kind of analysis. But then again, a certain sector that we do very consciously lends itself to that kind of analysis. So it starts precisely at the kind of sectoral angle that we are taking, and then where the opportunities are to feed in. But I think as research on this becomes more tractable, funding improves, I think all of us together understand what we mean by gender mainstreaming. These are very early conversations, and the more we have of these kind of platforms, I think we will be better able to answer your question. I'm not sure that addressed your concerns, but what I'm saying very honestly is that we hear these concerns, and we're very happy to take them on board going forward as the next part of the research agenda. So thank you.
Great. We have the chat box buzzing with quite a few questions. So we have a comment from Laura. Laura, if you would unmute yourself, and if you want to make your comment live, and after you have made your comment, I would like to move on to the other questions. Laura?
Sure, yes, absolutely. Hi, thank you so much for this fascinating discussion. I mean, my comment was just a bit of a reflection on our own research on kind of urban planners and the issue of integrity in the profession. And we have been specifically working in South Africa and Zambia. And in my view, there were just different layers, you know, the systemic inequalities we are aware of, which include gender inequalities. I think we need to make these visible and like take note of it in our research and throughout our research. But at the same time, I think there are strategic and I think there are ways in which we can splice gender questions into surveys and into interviews, specifically when it comes around to questions of sexual abuse or favoritism or advantages, etc. But at the same time, it doesn't mean kind of a priori shoehorning the issue into things, especially when we think about you know, kind of very conservative readings of gender, as we've already said, like a male-female dichotomy that might be foreclosing more things that it might be revealing. So in our case as well, we are working in a context where homosexuality and queerness is heavily criminalized. So how do we even then, include questions that are then not putting our respondents in harm's way in a way, right? Because it also goes back to the question of research ethics in this in this respect, in contexts where we know that exposure might be harmful, and at the same time it's a systemic issue. It's an issue where we want to have an active advocacy voice, and I think that what was said before about maybe having an advocacy angle to the research, but then not trying to push everything into the a priori research design. I think that was something that resonated for me and that I'm still reflecting on. And I just wanted to know, and some of you have partly answered that already, about how do we actually go about this in our research? And it's obviously treading a very fine line.
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for the advocacy angle. So I would ask Frank to come on live and ask his question. And Jackie, I would like you to answer it because that does have an activist angle. So Frank, if you would ask your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is fascinating discussion. First of all, just a comment. I think this issue of gender and corruption is the single hardest issue in the whole landscape of anti-corruption to deal with, partly because of the difficulties of research that the last questioner just posed. And I think that's the reason why for years, organizations that I'm a co-founder of Transparency International. We failed completely for 20 years to come to grips with this issue, in part because of lack of research and in part because of tremendous trepidation. Many national chapters just didn't want to touch such a sensitive issue. So congratulations on this. And that brings me to my question. How do we get better information about the research that is going on in this area in a way that we can promote it, not just amongst small groups of researchers, but also to the broader human rights, anti-corruption, civil society communities? They are starved of this kind of research and they don't really know where to look for it. And it seems to me that if we could broaden the awareness of where the research is, what research is being done on a continuous basis in the area of gender and corruption, then we could get many of the project implementing groups to pay far more attention to this, and of course feed back into the research as well. So how do we do that? So, sorry for such a practical question. Thank you.
Jackie, you're on.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I want to recognize that there is a lot of work that's been done in the academic community around gender and corruption. And there is this, warning that I think was already mentioned maybe by Pallavi, that, we should also not see women as political cleaners, as Anne-Marie Goetz talked about, that, a lot of times women are not in these corrupt networks because that's a reflection of the gender inequality in society. And they are disproportionately often victims because they are less powerful. So a lot of, and I think Claudia also mentioned some of the research that's showing, just having women in corridors of power isn't going to fix our corruption problem. So we have to get away. So the research is showing that we can't have these simplistic ideas. So to begin with, that's very important. And then second of all, I just think that, our corruption issues are so grave and they intersect with so many different critical aspects of our future, whether that's environmentalism or gender equality and other issues. And, our gender inequality problem is also profound, although we have mass, as Sohela is part of, these feminist movements that are really exciting, and they are linking up with allies in environmental groups and others to address our deep governance problems that are linked to corruption. So I think one way is really, Frank, I don't know if this is going to help, but I think maybe to have more forums like this where we can bring the anti-corruption groups together with those who are involved in these feminist and other movements to see how we bring these, how would we work together? And I think this is starting to happen. So, Bill McKibben, who's like an enormous advocate around addressing climate change, has recently said that HR 1 in the United States, which is a bill that aims to address various kinds of corruption that are really transforming our political system in very negative ways and prevents us from addressing climate change, is one of the most important climate bills. So, we need to start having these inter kind of sectional, I guess, Sohela, conversations. Maybe we need to have more fora like this to figure out how we work together and generate creative projects that work on these different angles. So together. So I don't know if that's a really good, I don't know, it's we can keep talking about this, but it's obviously a big problem we need to solve.
If we were live, I would have told Frank, let's step aside, and I'll tell you that in the Feminist Futures discussion at UN Women, we were talking about how to use the anti-corruption agenda for forwarding Feminist Futures plan. And I know that TI is organizing at UNGA a special session on anti-corruption, and feminists are thinking about how do you engage with that space. So, there are different spaces and different discussions. But let's move on because there are questions in the chat box. Dina, would you like to ask your question live to Claudia? And Claudia, once you have answered that, then Pallavi, we have a question for you. So Dina, go ahead.
So thank you very much. This is incredibly interesting, although I came late and I missed some of the presentations, unfortunately. I just wanted to ask a question. I'm working with Pallavi and Prof. Khan on looking at absenteeism and gender networks and so forth. But what became apparent that we only started noticing these issues, issues around gender and, for example, how gender networks shape absenteeism. We started noticing it quite late in the research. We knew that we want to look at gender and we were aware, but exactly how this influences absenteeism became clear almost towards the end of the fieldwork data collection. Now we are doing a separate study interviews with female doctors, particularly because we realized that there is this complex web of disadvantages and advantages. Some women are in a very fortunate position because they're in the right social network and they can actually do a lot more than others. And these inequalities and gender and class and all that is interspersed. But what I would have, if I can go back in a way, I wish I knew a lot of this in the beginning. So I wonder, what are the ways to, we work in health. And I think a lot of the things that you're talking about, I've learned from reading information and literature outside health. So my question is, how do we connect the dots? So in health, we talk a lot about impact on women or role of women, but we don't delve deep into the power issues, into the issues around societal position and capital. So I'm just asking a question, how do you think in practice we can start overcoming these disciplinary boundaries? We start a project in health. How do we connect to people and to the right people? Are there any, even in particular country, how do we find out more almost at the start and be aware of that? And I'm talking, I think, generally, when we were submitting also a paper looking at the informal payments among men and women, again, some of the reviewers, the comments were, clearly they were not aware of all these debates or complexities. They were looking in a very basic way. So how do we build this capacity to look at more complex issues? Thank you.
So Claudia, how do you build capacity? $1 million question.
So thank you, Dina, for this question. And actually, this allows me to touch on a topic that has been on my mind for some time, which is how I think it's really not useful how we, in our respective fields tend to gravitate together with the people who are working in similar topics from similar angles, and we just fall into these kind of buckets that are not speaking to each other. And I think about these topics, and no offense, please, but when I go, for instance, to the International Anti-Corruption Conference, it's fantastic. So many people come, and I've been in this field for over a decade, so there's always a lot of familiar faces. It's almost like a family reunion. At the same time, half of the people I know more or less already what they're going to say. So my point is that we're speaking to each other, we're preaching to the choir, right? And I think that what we need to do is to get out of our comfort zone and talk to people on a regular basis with whom we would normally not be talking to. So I'm really happy, very, very recently I got in contact with Dina again, and she's a health sector specialist. And we met years ago at the WHO. And just talking to her again, it brings, new different perspectives and insights. I've also started working with colleagues who are coming from the behavioral sciences side of the equation. So thinking more about what are the psychological factors that make us make decisions the way we do, that do, explain in a way how, why our principal agent approaches to fight corruption are not necessarily working. So I guess what I would really encourage people to do is to, be brave. Let's step out of our comfort zones and talk to people we normally wouldn't.
So thanks, Claudia, in terms of capacity. That's brilliant, because it's not the stepping out of our silos and talking to others, but it's also about having a multidisciplinary research and questioning our frameworks. So principal agent framework, very gender neutral framework, doesn't work. And agents don't behave the way they behave. Everything's gendered in that sense. But apart from that, there's also a question from Tasneem, and Pallavi, I'd like you to answer this. So Tasneem, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, but before, just to pick a couple of sentences, I really found this session very interesting. It was lovely to know that sextortion is being discussed. And because, I come from the water and sanitation sector, I work with Water Integrity Network. I think, Frank, we've met in another life. I'm not so sure though. And this year we're taking on sextortion in the water and sanitation sector. So hopefully we get to start projects or research projects in Bangladesh. And I found it very refreshing that you talked about this cross-disciplinary approach, because we are only reaching out to partners we know work in that sector. And we're not able to reach out to research or gender experts out of that sector who can guide us more. So I think just that y'all have mentioned it reinforces this belief that we should be looking out elsewhere as well. I'm quite a practivist myself. It's great to do research, but then what? And Jacqueline mentioned the social enterprise, and that went bing, bing, that's fantastic. But I'd like to know if there are other examples where you've taken this research forward. It has led to changes on the ground, or changes on policy level. That's refreshing to know that your research is going somewhere and you're making use of what's coming out of it. Thanks.
So Pallavi, outreach and uptake, and how does policy make impact?
How does? Sorry.
Policy, how does research make policy impact or real life change?
Tasneem, thanks. Sorry, go ahead.
I said it's easy peasy.
Yeah, absolutely. The easiest kind of question that you can think of when you're doing research on anti-corruption. How does research become policy, outreach, and impact? I think I'm speaking up for a lot of researchers in this sector. Before that, I'd like to make one point here, and I'm hearing a lot of you speak, and you're talking about working in WASH. You're talking about sextortion. These are all aspects. If you just take a step back and think about it, these are all aspects of almost public goods delivery. It's about delivery of services, whether it's in the health sector, you're talking about sanitation, you're talking about governance and policing, you're talking about the judiciary. And I have seen, and I speak personally here, I have seen that it is, at least on paper, easier to design. I would put it this way, the design of solutions in these kind of sectors using a sort of mobilizational organizational framework is relatively easier than when you're looking at the kind of sectors that, let's say, SOAS-ACE works in designing subsidies that are politically captured in the electricity sector, or indeed when skills trainers do fraud while training employees who then go to other organizations, but the organizations misreport the number of employees. We are talking about very different profiles of corruption, if I might even frame it that way. And the kind of impact and outreach we are talking about when we are framing questions based on corruption in more sort of public goods delivery work, as opposed to strictly more private sector work where the government's delivery mechanisms and sort of delivery touch points come in much less, are actually very different. And I think this is something that we need to keep in mind, the difference. I mean, we've done excellent work with Dina and Dina's team at LSHTM that got us thinking much more in terms of the sort of public goods service delivery related work. But on our side, we would absolutely welcome more conversations with political economists, with gender analysts on the more private sector related corruption, which is actually a huge ACE mandate that's actually in the ACE business case, private sector corruption. And that's why we're looking there. And the mechanics of corruption there and the patron-client networks that we talk about there are very different. The informality is very different. But the private sector is a huge part of our lives. At the end, also impacting service delivery. Training is a kind of service delivery. Electricity provision is service delivery. But the sort of solutions are very different. And therefore, from the solutions, the policy you make and the outreach that you can then design are also going to be different. So I think as we are integrating gender into anti-corruption research, it's also very important for us in terms of the sectors that we are targeting. Too often we talk about policing, we talk about judicial reforms, we obviously, and these are extremely important aspects of anti-corruption. Equally important aspects of anti-corruption are how you deal with corruption in the private sector, which will frequently involve communities of citizens and the public sector, but it's a very different dynamic there. So when you're talking about outreach and impact, who we talk to then becomes very important. We might need to talk to a private sector organization for whom the gendered impact is actually quite secondary. So then what do you start prioritizing? So in that sense, when we do our research and think about outreach and impact, we think in terms of boundary partners, which we found actually very helpful, and not necessarily stakeholders. Everybody can have an interest in the research that you're doing, because obviously everybody's interested in how power is provisioned, or cheap, reliable power is provisioned legally. But not everybody has in themselves to actually impact the policy or make sure the policy is enforced. So we take a very narrow, I would say, approach towards who to access as people who can help us with policy implementation, not just policy design, because there's no point in designing policy unless it's implemented. So for us, outreach is as important as the implementation aspect. And we've thought through very carefully in ACE for that, which sometimes means that we don't reach a larger body of people, but we're at least sure that if you're reaching out to people who can enforce, who it's in their interest to enforce, the outreach and impact of what we are suggesting as research actually is higher. I'm going to stop here, happy to answer any cross clarifications, but I think it's just something I wanted to put into the pot. What are the mechanics and dynamics of corruption that we are addressing when we think about outreach? Thank you.
So with that, actually, I'm going to bring the discussion session to a close using my chair's prerogative, because we have 5 minutes left. But thank you all for the very exciting questions that you asked, and also the very insightful and thought-provoking answers that the panelists provided. I think I'm hearing a few things that are the key takeaways. One is, of course, there's a lot in the design. If you're using a framework that's gender neutral, you're going to get results that are going to show gender is not important. So you need to stop thinking about gender, not something that needs to be added and stirred later way down the road. You need to stop thinking about it from the beginning in terms of how does it matter. Sometimes it might be hidden in terms of where it is. Sometimes it might be the implications of your research in terms of what kind of impact you want to have and the differential impact on men and women. Sometimes it might be about women as actors and experiencing corruption itself, and the corruption itself may be gender specific, for example, thinking about sextortion. So think your way through, as Claudia said, think in terms of clearly and think in a very precise manner, how does it come in? But I also hear in terms of what Jackie and others have spoken about in terms of having not just an interdisciplinary lens, but also talking to different communities, your epistemic communities, what Pallavi also emphasized in terms of going beyond usually who you talk to and do your research with, not just for impact, but also thinking about the design. Apart from that, of course, there's the whole debate about, for researchers, which is very interesting, when you're thinking about gender and integrating it in your research, is that a dependent variable or an independent variable? Because then your design will vary and what you get will vary. But also, in terms of, there's the issue about how do we push the agenda? So Jackie's plea about why aren't we doing more research on anti-corruption that has a gender lens, or Pallavi's point about how are researchers funded and how does that sort of restrict what we look at? So who's in the space and who's setting up the agenda? And of course, research is, I mean, all of us also work in development. Knowledge is not, we just don't produce knowledge because, oh, knowledge is fantastic and it's just for knowledge's sake. We produce it because it will be used in a particular way. So who's picking that up? How are we building those alliances? So the whole chat we had with Frank and others in terms of where are your people? Both in terms of epistemic, but also who would use the knowledge. And it's not only the researcher's duty to think about policy impact, it's part of it, of course, but it's also for users. And how do you build those alliances? How do we create those spaces where we can cooperate? So that's what I'm taking away from this. These are some recommended resources that you can use both for conceptual or practical kind of work, but this is just scratching the surface. There's a lot more. If you're interested in terms of looking at the video of this or link, the organizers have it. It's been recorded, so it will be shared. If you're interested in having more discussions, there's a working group we are planning to set up. So please do get in touch with Ambika if you're interested in being a part of that. But thank you so much for such an exciting and invigorating session. And I hope this is the start of a more interesting conversation in this area of work. So thank you very much.